Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan Nolte, for coming on Wellness Your Way. I am very excited to have you here today.
I'm delighted to be here. We just finished recording an episode for my podcast, and that one was more about like weight and thyroid. And I just thought you were such a wealth of information. I'm really honored to be on your show too.
And vice versa. It's such a great partnership. Hopefully, the beginning of lots of collaborations. And what we're going to talk about today is actually related to those topics that you mentioned. We're specifically focusing on insulin resistance, which is your area of expertise. So I'm very excited to get into that. But before we do, I'd love for you to tell our audience just a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I mean, the basics. I live in Nebraska. Go Big Red for any Husker fans out there. I have two kids. Dawson's 5 and Leah's 3, married to a farmer. We're moving to the farm this year, and I'm very excited about that, to start some more gardening and just be in that rural life. I'm a geriatric physical therapist by trade, and that's really how I got interested in the field of insulin resistance. It's not something that I learned about in school, but it's something that I pieced together over many years of working with patients. And the way that I like to describe insulin resistance is it comes in stages, and we can get into that. You know, there's rocks, there's pebbles, there's rocks, there's boulders. And you may have heard that before, where it's like, okay, if life is trying to teach you a lesson, you're going to get a little pebble. And if you don't pay attention to that, then you're going to get a rock. And if you still don't pay attention, you're going to get a boulder. And when it comes to insulin resistance, the boulders are strokes. The boulders are diabetic retinopathy and neuropathy, to the point where you're falling and you can't see. It's amputations, it's heart attacks, it's really devastating falls that ruin someone's quality of life. And so as a geriatric PT, I worked both in post-acute skilled rehab and home care. And so I saw boulder after boulder after boulder, and I felt like we are doing too little too late. We're spending months of time and so many resources on rehab, when if we could spend the same amount of time and resources proactively to help them get healthy 20 or 30 years earlier, we wouldn't have this boulder. They wouldn't have this huge hit to their quality of life and their family's quality of life. And when I was doing chart reviews, often with people with diabetes or heart disease, I noticed they never come just with diabetes. They never just have heart disease. They always had that triad of high blood pressure, high blood sugar, altered lipids, usually some sort of cognitive impairment too. And it didn't have to be full-blown dementia, but it was definitely to the point where they weren't following through as much as maybe someone 10 or 20 years younger would have. And I was like, well, there's got to be a common denominator. And lo and behold, it's insulin resistance. And so when I decided to go back to work after I had my son, I said, if I'm going to work, I'm going to do something that I am so passionate about, that I feel like makes the greatest impact in someone's life. And that's to teach them how to live a low insulin and low inflammation lifestyle, so that they can prevent and reverse insulin resistance, to avoid those boulders down the road and maintain as high of a quality of life as possible, maintain as much activity and independence, so that they can live that joyful retirement that they want. Because unfortunately, a lot of people abuse their bodies. You know, they're overworked, they're overstressed. They say, I'm going to deal with my health one day. And then in their 50s and their 60s, that one day comes, and they thought, oh man, I've neglected this part of my life for so long. So that's our joy. Like, that's really the population of people that we love to help, because we know what's coming for them if they don't take action in their 50s, in their 60s. But you know, like, the sooner the better. Even if you're 30, in your 30s, 40s listening to this, everything that we're going to talk about still applies.
Yes, I'm chuckling at myself. I'm such a softie. I literally got goosebumps when you were talking, because I can tell your heart for this. You've seen the boulders, you've seen the really rough stuff. And unfortunately, if we look at the statistics, it is a bit of a dismal story out there. But you and I both know that we can do a lot about this, and we can eliminate those boulders. Maybe eliminating them on a society level, that's a huge task. We're not going to attempt to do that. But each individual can take charge of their health and really reduce the likelihood of encountering those boulders. So I'm so thrilled that you're out there doing the good work, and you've painted the picture very well. You heard and saw the boulders. You saw the detrimental impact of this. You've tossed around the word insulin resistance, and I think my audience is probably more familiar than the average person with that concept, but I'd love to hear in your words, what is insulin resistance?
Yeah, well, in order to understand insulin resistance, we have to understand insulin. Insulin is a vital hormone. It's made in your pancreas. And without insulin, you have type 1 diabetes. And without supplemental insulin, you die. So we need insulin. It's not a bad thing. And it plays really a lot of roles in our body. But the most common one is blood sugar regulation. So when you eat, especially carbohydrates, your blood sugar will go up, and insulin will be released to push that blood sugar into your cells to maintain a stable blood sugar level of, your body really likes it between about 70 and 100. 100's a little bit high fasting even, but your body hates change. So as soon as that blood sugar goes up, that insulin is going to go up to help push the blood sugar into either your muscle tissue or your fat tissue or storage somewhere else, so that we have stable blood sugars. That's really insulin's job. If we're thinking about insulin resistance, it's very similar to resistance of other substances, such as antibiotics or alcohol or any other drug. So I like to describe it as an alcoholic who used to get a buzz after a couple of drinks, and now it takes 4 or 5 drinks for them to get that same effect. Or maybe someone used to be sensitive to antibiotics, but they've had so many UTIs that their body doesn't really respond to the antibiotic anymore. They have to do more. They have to try a different one. The same goes with insulin. And what's really, really important to understand is every single cell in your body has an insulin receptor. So very much like diabetes, it doesn't just affect one part of your body or one organ. It affects everything. Insulin resistance is diabetes, by the way. And we'll talk about kind of how does that all develop. So your body becomes resistant to the effects of insulin, which means your body has a harder time controlling your blood sugars. More and more insulin has to be released from your pancreas to keep the blood sugars in a normal range. What's fascinating is that there's a study that's shown that fasting insulin levels can predict type 2 diabetes up to 2 decades before fasting glucose.
Wow.
And it's not standard on a blood panel.
Mm-hmm.
So if the first key takeaway from this is to check your fasting insulin, an optimal fasting insulin is less than 6. Okay. And that's really a pretty tight range. You really have to have your health habits dialed in to get that low of a fasting insulin, but that's really what we're looking for. And often people will have a normal hemoglobin A1C, which is a 3-month average of blood sugar, or they might even have a normal fasting insulin level, or they may be on the low end of prediabetes. But what they don't recognize is that it's taken really decades to get to that point of insulin resistance. And so if you were to check your fasting insulin, it could still be pretty far above the optimal range and still be keeping that blood sugar in a normal range. So that's why I'm such an advocate for testing for insulin, because it gives you 10 to 20 years of a heads up before you see the clinical symptom of diabetes, that diagnostic criteria, of a certain A1C level or a certain fasting blood sugar level. So that's one big takeaway, is just because you have a normal A1C or a normal blood sugar doesn't mean that you don't have an insulin problem. And you also don't really need to have a weight problem. That's another thing that we can talk about. Insulin resistance often is accompanied by weight loss resistance or being overweight or being obese, but it doesn't always have to be.
Yeah.
So there's something called thin on the outside, fat on the inside, TOFI. I didn't make that up. That actual clinical term is TOFI. And checking your fasting insulin is a great way to be sure that you're not one of those people. Also,
Yes.
checking fasting insulin can help really catch people who are considered metabolically healthy obese. And I think this is really interesting too, because the normal criteria for being metabolically healthy obese is having like a larger waist circumference and one other symptom of metabolic syndrome. So like high triglycerides, high blood sugar, high blood pressure, and low HDL, plus a large waist circumference. But if you use fasting insulin as an indicator for metabolically healthy obese, you catch 43% more of those people.
Wow.
So while maybe 50% of people with obesity think they're healthy, only 7% are actually maybe truly metabolically healthy. So that's another big reason. It's weight independent. You can't tell it with your blood sugar. But if you want to prevent the boulders, if you want to have as many years as you can to make these lifestyle changes, and it does take years sometimes, check your fasting insulin. And you can do that. We have it on our website. You can go to zivli.com/testing. We have an at-home option, but you can go to walkinlab.com or testing.com and order yourself an insulin test to go to the lab. You can ask your doctor about it, but often doctors have no idea why you're doing that. They are not taught this in school. I have had obesity specialists contact me and say, hey, I'm learning a lot from your YouTube channel. We weren't taught this in school. I don't have the time to talk about this with my clients in the clinic. So we have a great YouTube playlist all about insulin resistance for beginners for people to start with too.
That's so amazing. You've given us so many pearls. So I'm going to walk through it to summarize and make sure the audience is still on the same page. Insulin's a helpful hormone that helps get the blood sugar glucose from floating around in our blood into our cells where we want it. However, if we call on that over and over and over, insulin tends to rise. Just like we lose alcohol sensitivity, we'll lose insulin sensitivity. So that fasting insulin will be creeping up. And that's why we want to test fasting insulin, not just fasting blood sugar. I just recorded a podcast yesterday, a solo podcast, where I talked about the 4 blood tests that people might be missing. So at the time this comes out, it will have been a few weeks ago. But I was in complete agreement with you that fasting insulin is essential to know the whole picture. Just a fasting glucose almost tells us nothing. I mean, it's like more helpful than literally nothing, but it does not tell the whole picture. So I love the statistics that you said. We can catch this decades in advance by just looking at that fasting insulin. That is huge. Thank you for sharing that.
And advocate to yourself, like for yourself. My dad's a type 2 diabetic, and I asked him to ask his PA to order a fasting insulin test, and she wouldn't. She said, oh, well, the hemoglobin A1C is good enough. And I said, well, she doesn't know who your daughter is, and that's not going to fly with me.
Yes.
So I think it's also a great indicator of progress, because you're going to see that change in your insulin level, maybe even before you see a change in your A1C. So I think that's really fun too, for people to have other non-scale ways to gauge their progress.
Yes, absolutely. That's incredible. So love that you're providing that option from your website and those other options as well. I'll tell you, I can't remember the exact price, but it's not, people think when their doctor will say, no, you can't run this test, that it's like $1,000 test or something like that. It's not. It's in the tens of dollars, not the thousands of dollars. So really great to have that available. Now, insulin resistance is on the rise today. Some people will say that's because we're better at diagnosing it. We never tested fasting insulin decades ago, which part of that might be true. But I think there are many other factors. Why do you think insulin resistance is on the rise today?
Well, you're right that it is on the rise. One study came out and said only 12% of American adults are metabolically healthy.
Yeah.
which means that 88% of them have some degree of insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the reasons that we're becoming more familiar with it is testing is becoming easier. So for a long time, glucose is just an easier molecule to test. We don't have continuous insulin monitoring technology yet, but we have continuous glucose monitoring. So I think one reason that people don't really know about it very much is because we've been so focused on glucose, which is a downstream effect. So we really want to move upstream towards the source of the problem. I think there are so many factors that have led to our society becoming more and more unhealthy. I think the first and foremost is a diet high in processed foods, a diet high in refined starches and sugars that spike blood sugar, that will therefore spike blood insulin. I think that's first and foremost. When we're talking about insulin resistance, we must really focus on a whole foods diet. The second thing is stress. And I don't know about you, but I feel like streaming services may be just a smidge to blame because they make those really good TV shows that you just want to stay up and watch a little bit more and more. And so many people don't understand that when you're chronically sleep deprived, that's a stress on your body. And any form of stress, we mentioned this on my show, metabolic stress, emotional stress, physiological stress, environmental stress, all that will raise cortisol. And cortisol is kind of one of your primary stress hormones. And it's also a good thing when we need cortisol, we need it to run away from something that's trying to get us. What cortisol does is it causes a rise in your blood sugar so that there's available energy for your muscles to fight or flee the situation. But if we're stressed out because we're sleep deprived, or because we're checking our email at all hours of the night, stressing ourselves out, or because we just have negative thought loops going around in our brain, well, we're not using that blood sugar. I'm going to explain something that's really important for people to understand on how your blood sugar is used. But if you don't use it with your muscles, it requires insulin. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons that I think physical inactivity, which is on the rise, more sitting time, more desk jobs, that's also contributing to more insulin resistance.
Yes.
So I think there's definitely a combination of factors, a lifestyle of convenience, a busy lifestyle. We're seeking instant gratification. And unfortunately, health is just not as high of a priority as it should be in many people's lives. They're not valuing their health. They're taking it for granted when they're younger and not really thinking ahead 10 or 20 years of, well, what do I need? What do I want to do at age 70 or at age 80? And what do I need to do now to be able to set my future self up for that success? And so going back to that blood sugar conversation and insulin resistance, I really like to emphasize the importance of muscle mass when it comes to having healthy insulin levels. So muscle mass, your skeletal muscle mass, think of, your quads, your glutes, your biceps, all of your muscles. That's where about 80% of the glucose or sugar goes after you eat a meal. So the more muscle mass you have, the more carbohydrates you can tolerate in your diet without those carbohydrates being shuttled off to your fat cells. And being a Husker fan, I like to think of the Husker football stadium, right? And that's a pretty big stadium. For people that don't know, the Husker football stadium, when it is full, is the third largest city in Nebraska. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I think that's kind of a fun fact.
It is.
Yeah. So all of those stadiums, like that's a big muscle. Compare that to like a high school stadium that's a smaller muscle. So the bigger stadium you have, the bigger muscle you have, the more glucose you can put in your cells. Now, the gates that people walk through, okay, you have to stand outside, you have to go through a gate. Those are called GLUT4 transporters. Think of them like a tube slide that the glucose is sliding from outside to inside, outside to inside. And usually those gates are shut. Usually they're not on the cell membrane. But when insulin binds to its receptor on the cell, or when you move your body, when you're exercising, those gates open. So the only way the gates open is with exercise or insulin. Those are the only way that people get into the stadium, that glucose gets into the muscles. And that's why I'm such a big proponent of movement after meals, especially is a really nice tip to lower your blood sugar, but also prioritizing resistance training. I think so many of our clients were kind of bred in that age of low fat, cardio is king. If they're not burning a lot of calories during their workouts, they don't feel like it's an effective workout. They're afraid of bulking up. They really have that lens of low fat. And the problem is that low fat often, not always, means high carb.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a more nuanced conversation about different calories and how different calories impact insulin. But I think the first takeaway here is check your fasting insulin. The second takeaway is start moving your body, even if it's like a 5 or 10 minute walk after meals. Invest in a trainer or someone skilled to help you develop a strength training program. As a geriatric PT, I can tell you that muscle mass is really important for bone health so that you don't fall and fracture your bones, and for sarcopenia mitigation, which is the loss of muscle mass with age. So if you don't want to need a lift chair when you're 80, you need muscles. You need muscles to get up out of chairs, to get down on the floor and play with your grandkids. So second takeaway, start taking your physical activity routine more seriously.
Yes, so amazing. Those short walks after meals and getting in that strength training, to not easy, but relatively simple things that actually move the needle significantly. That's really wonderful. So you've mentioned several times testing your fasting insulin, and you said less than 6, which I love that range. I've seen on lab ranges, depending on which lab you go to, less than 20 is a common one, sometimes less than 10. But I agree that, well, I was going to say the lower, the better. I think if you have 0, that would not be a good thing.
Yeah.
So not quite the lower, the better, but under 6, that is a really tight range. That's wonderful. That's going to be very preventative of future issues, including those boulders. So amazing there. How about symptom wise? If people haven't yet gotten the test, they're going to do that next month or something like that. Would they feel anything if they were starting to develop insulin resistance?
Yeah, but they might have to pay close attention.
Ah,
I like to use I don't know if this is even true, but they say if you put a frog in a pot of water and slowly turn the heat up, it'll die
yes.
if it doesn't
Yes.
rise, versus throwing a frog into a pot of boiling water and it freaks out because it's so different. And I think a lot of people, because this is such a gradual onset, they just get used to feeling bad. They get used to feeling tired. They get used to the excess weight. They get used to the brain fog. Those are some of those early pebbles that that I was talking about earlier. Okay, what are the very first signs and symptoms? Carb cravings. If you crave carbohydrates and sugars, whether it's salty or sweet foods, that could be a sign. Another one is skin tags. So around the neck, especially, your skin is kind of it's a very interesting gateway to your health. Your skin really says a lot about your health. So some skin tags, those might be in the rock category as well. Weight gain can be a sign of insulin resistance, not always. If you're eating a lot of high quality, nutrient dense foods, maybe you're exercising, but you're just eating more than you need to eat to maintain your goal body weight, you may not have insulin resistance. It may just really be an energy balance situation. Fatigue. So if you're tired all of the time, if you're having some sort of thyroid issue, that can sometimes be kind of a flag to check it. If you have, probably you're not going to notice this because doctors just don't really test for it, but non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is a huge symptom. They really go hand in hand.
Yes.
And some of the rocks, like if we're kind of moving into it, it's elevated blood sugar, but you're not diabetic yet. Your doctor might just say, oh, let's just watch it for now and wait and see. Or high blood pressure, high triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, and increased waist circumference. All of those are going to be more of the symptoms. And then the rocks are going to be when you're actually diagnosed with diabetes and your doctor says you have 3 months to lower your A1C or you have to start a medication.
Yeah.
3 months to lower your blood pressure or we have to put you on a medication. That's when you're in the rock stage, because once the doctor starts a medication, they are very reluctant to stop it. And I'm
Yes.
not kidding. Like, I've had clients get off their blood pressure medications in a few months, but it took them nearly passing out to get there.
Mm.
And we tell all of our clients, all of our members up front, when you start this lifestyle change, please check your blood sugar. Please check your blood pressure, especially if you're on medications, because it's very easy to overshoot and then have symptoms of low blood sugar and low blood pressure that can be scary and dangerous.
Yes.
Those would be some of the symptoms. Do you think of any other ones besides the ones that I mentioned?
I think you really well covered them. The thing that I think I hear people saying who are listening is, oh, yeah, I'm kind of tired. Oh, yeah, I kind of have weight loss resistance. Oh, yeah, all these things. Maybe not the skin tags. That's something
Yeah.
that is pretty isolated and not super common to many other conditions. But they're thinking, well, maybe this is me. Maybe this is not. And part of that is because these factors like fatigue, they can be so multifactorial. So many things can cause fatigue. But another thing that I will say to that is that's more reason to test, not guess. I love listening to the body. I think the body is so powerful and it will tell us so much when we've overdone it or when we need some more healthy, fresh foods because our digestion slowed down or something like that. But with something like this and many other chronic diseases, I really do believe that knowing your numbers is so powerful because of what you're saying. It's linked to Alzheimer's is often called type 3 diabetes. It's very linked to non-alcoholic fatty liver. It's so much more interwoven when we talk about these complex chronic conditions than we think. It's not just like, poof, you get non-alcoholic fatty liver. It really does develop in almost all cases over time.
Yeah, and
So,
you alluded to sorry for interrupting, you alluded to
no,
the fasting insulin being like 20. A lot of times how they're doing that is they're aggregating data and they're going on
yes.
averages, and the average person is sick. 88% of adults are not metabolically healthy. So if we're going off of their data, we don't want to be average we don't want to be average. We want to be optimal. So I just wanted to plug that, especially for like liver enzymes too, I think is another one where people might miss the mark on the optimal range. So
Yes.
just kind of a heads up on that.
Absolutely. So we're skirting around the topic of liver. Let's go there. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is definitely on the rise, just like insulin resistance. And like we just said, they're enmeshed together. So can you explain to us the connection between these two and what the liver has to do with all of this?
Yes, the liver is a really important detoxification organ. First and foremost, its job is really to detox the blood. And with insulin resistance and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, the link that I've seen from the literature is fructose. And so when we eat a diet that's high in fructose, whether that's from natural sugars like honey or agave or maple syrup or fruit juice, or the added sugars, brown sugar, white sugar, all of those, it's really important that it doesn't matter. Like honey, agave is even higher in fructose than high fructose corn syrup. So a lot of people are substituting these natural sugars for regular sugar, thinking they're doing themselves a favor, but they're not. Coconut sugar is another example. Obviously, the more natural, the better, but we really need to reduce our sugar intake because I think it comes to a little bit more of a nuanced conversation of sugar. So if we're talking about sugar, there's glucose and there's fructose and there's galactose. Those are the three primary simple sugars. Now, glucose is that type of sugar that's found circulating throughout your bloodstream. That's why we call it blood glucose. Any cell in your body can use that glucose, can metabolize that glucose for energy. So if you're eating pasta, if you're eating bread, if you're eating bagels, that can be used anywhere in your body. But we'll use table sugar for an example. Table sugar is a substance called sucrose, which is made of half glucose and half fructose. Those two simple sugars are bound together to create table sugar. Fine, the glucose can go wherever, but the fructose is almost exclusively metabolized in the liver. And when we have a very high amount of fructose coming to our liver at once, it only has so much capacity to metabolize it. So a lot of it is shunted off to liver fat pretty quickly and kind of stored there until it can be used. And what's really important to understand about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is it's reversible. In the early phases, it's completely reversible. It's very important to really reduce the sugar, especially the fructose in your diet. But that's why when someone asks me, what's worse, a bunch of sugar, a bunch of carbs, it's like starches, it's a bunch of sugar because of the fructose.
Yeah.
And so the other thing that's really important to recognize from a diabetic standpoint is that foods that are higher in fructose are typically lower on the glycemic index.
Yes. Like agave.
Yeah, agave, apple juice is going to be lower than other forms of starches, right? Because they're looking, what's the blood glucose response, the glycemic response. Well, we know now that fructose does not significantly raise your blood glucose response, but it's worse for your health than glucose.
Yes.
So a lot of diabetics are being taught to choose lower glycemic foods, and that's fine, but that's not the whole story. The other thing that's really important to recognize is this was from the book Nature Wants Us to Be Fat by Dr. Richard Johnson, which is a great read for someone who's interested in learning more about fructose. And he said, it's not just about the fructose that you eat, it's about the fructose that your body makes. And so your body actually makes fructose when it metabolizes a large amount of glucose at once, for example. So that's why I'm still not a huge fan of those high starch meals, especially for someone with insulin resistance and alcohol.
Yeah.
So the reason that alcohol, like alcoholic fatty liver disease and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, mimic each other pretty much 100% is because alcohol is then converted into fructose.
Yeah.
The other thing that's very important to recognize here is sugar cravings. So sugar begets sugar. And whether you're drinking alcohol, whether you're eating sugar, both of those will cause more sugar cravings. So I know that for some people listening, when I first started learning about this, I was a little bit sad because I really ate a lot of sugar and I liked a lot of high sugar foods, and it was a lifestyle overhaul for me too. But it is so freeing to not feel like I have to eat every hour.
Yeah.
I don't, like in my PT school life, I felt like I snacked between every single class. I was having a Cliff Bar, which had like as much sugar as a Snickers bar, and I just didn't know. So that's another really big connection. When we're talking about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, you got to really watch the sugar and the alcohol and high amounts of starchy foods. Unless you're a heavy exerciser, then you can tolerate more starches and sugars. But the majority of people that we work with aren't heavy exercisers. So we have to start with that dietary intervention. So that's kind of the overview of insulin resistance, fatty liver. I'd love to know any of your thoughts to add to that.
Yeah, it's really, really great. I want to first reiterate for the audience, just because I don't think we've talked about fructose as much as you just have on the podcast, and this was really great. So 2 types of sugar, fructose and glucose. We also briefly talked about galactose, but we're going to kind of leave that off the table for most of this conversation. Glucose is easy to measure. So we have the continuous glucose monitors. We have the fasting glucose, all of that stuff. That used to get all the attention. And so when something like agave is lower in glucose because it's higher in fructose, and then people measure the blood glucose and they're like, oh, wow, this is lower glycemic. Glycemic is a measure of how quickly the glucose raises. They're completely not paying attention to the impact of fructose, which is another type of sugar that we just don't measure on a continuous basis. This fructose, though, has to be processed by the liver, which is already overburdened by dealing with all of the toxins and all of the things that we're putting into, onto, and around our bodies. And so when our liver cannot store this extra fructose somewhere or deal with it in a healthy way, it stores it as fat, which then accumulates into non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or alcoholic fatty liver disease in the case of alcohol turning into fructose. Is that kind of a summary of what you said?
So good. Yes.
Okay.
So good. Yeah.
Amazing. Really, really great. So when I see someone with a confluence of these symptoms, I see elevated fasting in insulin, but maybe not quite at a super, super alarming level. I see creeping up liver enzymes. I see creeping up maybe HSCRP inflammation. I see all of these things start creeping up to where they might not be caught as a disease state because they're not technically over a threshold that's arbitrarily defined by the averages in many cases, as you said. My alerts are all going off thinking, okay, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, all of this kind of stuff is starting to happen. And as strange as this sounds, I start to get excited because I'm like, we can change this before it turns into a problem. I think you feel the same way. Is that true?
I feel excited all the time. I don't care if someone has a fasting insulin of 10 or 30. Like, I'm always excited because there's always something that can be done. But yes, I think it depends on their motivation and their time. Like, if we're talking about barriers to dealing with this, I think a lot of it is just we get in our life rhythms. We get in our habits of eating, we get in our habits of movement, we get in our habits of sleep and TV time and stressors. It's hard to break habits. And so I think I love when someone comes to me, no matter what stage they're in, with a really strong why. Why do you want to get healthy? That is so important for people to understand on a visceral, deep level, because it has to be strong enough to get you in bed, to get you out of bed, if you want to go work out in the mornings or whatever. It has to be strong enough to overcome those normal rhythms of life that you've established over the decades.
Yes, absolutely. I love starting with the why. I work through it with all my clients. I'm confident that you do as well. And it's highlighted in your programs because sometimes change is a little bit hard. The benefit we know is so worth it and it gets easier over time. But let's talk about one of those things that's hard. Like you said, you used to eat a lot of sugar. Me too. I used to eat definitely less calories than I do now, but the composition was a lot different.
Right.
And I had those sugar cravings all the time. And it took a lot of effort for me to change them. So I would love to hear how you counsel people who love their sugar, they love their bread, they love their pasta. How do they start making some of these changes?
Absolutely. So I just want to give a couple examples. Like, I'm not kidding when I said I ate a lot of sugar. We had 3 kinds of puppy chow at my high school graduation party. My
Wow.
friends, but like, do you remember those Nutri-Grain granola bars with yogurt in them? Like
Yes.
okay. They'd put that at the end of the triple jump runway so that when I was like triple jump,
Oh my goodness.
I'd be like jumping to the granola bar.
That's funny.
I would bake all of the time. I was an anatomy TA. I would make like these funky little sugar cookies, super inappropriate, and bring them to anatomy class. And I don't know. I think it was ingrained in me. I had food pushers growing up from grandmas, and everyone's just like, here, let me give you sugar because I love you.
Yeah.
And so sugar was my love language, as it is, I'm sure, many people listening.
Yes.
And so first and foremost, I think understanding it on an intellectual level is important, like what we're talking about, so that when you understand the negative effects of too much sugar, it's not to say I never have it. I have it every week, but I have it in moderation and I have it intentionally, and I have developed these systems. But understanding it on an intellectual level made it a lot harder to justify my bad habits.
Yeah.
I was not lying to myself anymore.
Yeah.
And so the first thing is to understand sugar, understand the pebble, the rock, the boulder. Many people have a family history of diabetes or heart disease or dementia. And that's a big part of their why, is to prevent the health effects that they saw their parents or their aunt and their uncle or their brother and sister going through.
Yeah.
So once you understand it on an intellectual level, really keep that why top of mind. And so my why, I had this patient who we worked together for 9 months in rehab. He'd fallen. He was on the floor for 3 days. He experienced severe rhabdomyolysis, which is muscle wasting. He had diabetic wounds on his bottom, on his heel. He was a Hoyer lift, and he was probably less than 150 pounds, but he couldn't even like transfer out of bed.
Wow.
So we worked together for 9 months in rehab. And turns out I don't know, maybe a year later, Medicare denied the last 3 months of reimbursement.
Mm.
And they denied it because someone coded it, not me, but someone coded it as muscle weakness instead of rhabdomyolysis. And so Medicare is like, why does someone need 9 months of rehab for muscle weakness? And I was like, gosh, how much money did our company lose because someone miscoded one thing wrong? How did this man's quality of life change so significantly? And thank the good Lord for his glorious attitude, because he was walking out of there independently with a walker as he was before. And
Wow.
so, but I saw so many stories like that, and I'm like, what if he didn't love sugar? And,
Yeah.
he went home and he still loved his cranberry juice and Rice Krispie treats. I didn't talk about nutrition with him.
Yeah.
And I saw so many patients with diabetes and geriatric physical therapy, and I couldn't talk about nutrition with them. One time I did, and I got in trouble from a nursing supervisor. She called me into her office and sat me down, and she said, that's part of the nursing care path. And I said, oh, the nursing care path that's like run by the American Diabetes Association with crap nutrition advice. Okay. So that was really one of the turning points where it's like, I have to lead by example.
Yeah.
I can't just be lip service here and tell people to eat less sugar. I have to do it for myself so that I don't end up like these people who didn't know better, frankly,
Yeah.
didn't know better. So I had to really understand it intellectually. I had to figure out what my why was, and then I had to do it. And it started with reading food labels for me. So it started with, looking at the back of whatever food label I was eating. A lot of times it started with Cliff Bars in the middle of the night, breastfeeding my son. I don't know if you've ever gone through that experience, but snacks are big for breastfeeding mothers. And so I was looking, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's 20 some grams of sugar in here, of added sugar in here. Okay, I think I can optimize that choice. Then I looked at my coffee creamer, which was the peppermint mocha Coffee Mate. I was having 20 grams of added sugar in my coffee alone because there's 5 grams per tablespoon. I was doing 2 tablespoons per cup and then 2 cups. So I was having about as much sugar as in a Pepsi between the coffee creamer and the Cliff Bar.
Yeah.
So I viewed myself as a pretty healthy eater already. I was already health conscious, but I was not as sugar conscious as I should have been. And so I became like a sugar sleuth, and I just slowly went through one food product at a time, and I swapped it out for something else. So instead of the Cliff Bars, I got like the Kirkland protein bars. It's kind of like a good, better, best model. What's good, better, best? Instead of the coffee creamer, I got half and half with some sweet leaf stevia drops. And now I wean myself like off the stevia drops too, most of the time. And so, there's always a better option. And then once I learned about the sugars and I really reduced the added sugars in my diet, I looked at the natural sugars and I said, what kinds of fruits am I eating? I was eating a lot of bananas. I was eating a lot of apples. I was eating a lot of grapes. I was eating a lot of oranges, not dissing on those fruits. I still eat all of those fruits, but I biased my fruit intake now more towards the avocados, the strawberries, the raspberries, the blackberries, a little bit of blueberries. And so it was just one choice at a time that I optimized. And then I started learning about unhealthy fats. And I went, oh my gosh, like there are so many processed seed oils in these Terra chips that I was eating, in the popcorn oil that I was having, in so many different things. So I started with added sugars. Then I started with natural sugars. Actually, then with starches. So instead of regular pasta, now we have chickpea pasta, and I just have a smaller portion. Instead of regular bread, if I have bread, which is rare, I'll do a high protein bread or like these delicious keto rolls that have like chia seeds and almond flour and mozzarella cheese and eggs. And so finding those recipes that you love, finding little dessert alternatives that I thought were delicious but didn't spike my blood sugar or insulin, that was important. The book Atomic Habits I thought was excellent for this. That's one of our go-to reads and recommendations for. We have a master class about mastering your habits, and that's kind of based on that book. And so I restructured my environment to make the healthy food more obvious. We got rid of a lot of the unhealthy food in our house, or we put it like very high up on a shelf that I wasn't going to get to. And then habit stacking was very helpful for me after, especially for those hard habits. Like for me, it was the after dinner late night popcorn and chocolate chip snack that I would do a lot after the kids were in bed. Um, and I thought, oh, that is not good for my blood sugar, eating all those starches right before bed, eating all that sugar. And so I developed a habit stack technique where after dinner I would brush my teeth. And then I would either have a cup of hot tea or cold tea or sparkling water. And if I needed a piece of gum, that was like the third habit stack, like the third stopper. So sometimes you have to get creative in how you're breaking those habits. But the book Atomic Habits was really helpful. Start reading your food labels, start finding healthy food swaps, really. But it's a process. I'm always learning, always learning. I'm always growing. I'm always optimizing. So it just doesn't stop. Yeah.
I hope it doesn't stop because that keeps me energized too. I believe in continuous improvement, and as we know better, we do better. So that's why our audience is here today, learning more, and they're going to be inspired from you to take a few steps. I echo the pattern that you went through. I used to have 6 packets of Splenda in my coffee,
Oh, yeah.
which maybe from an insulin perspective might be better than the coffee mate, but from an overall health perspective, I wanted to change that. And I changed just like you with the liquid stevia, and then eventually titrating down. I probably started with a jillion drops and then a few less drops. And now I appreciate unsweetened coffee, and it's amazing. And I use some nut pods, or I think half and half is a great option as well, something like that. But it was a process, and I still am not to the point where, ice cream doesn't taste good. I'm not like a robot over here that says, oh, that's disgusting. But my taste buds for sure have changed over time to where I'm not craving that stuff and feeling like I need that stuff, and my energy and my metabolism and all of that. So I think for anyone listening, just have hope based on what Dr. Nolte said and my experience as well. The gradual changes do add up to so much more. And this is a great transition into your program because you have just touched the tip of the iceberg today with actual action steps. But I know your program helps people go into it a lot more and actually implement the change. So can you tell us about Zivli and how people can learn more about it?
I'd love to. And thanks for giving me this opportunity to share. So Zivli is our comprehensive program that helps adults reverse, lower, prevent insulin resistance. We really teach them how to live a low insulin and inflammation lifestyle. We cover everything from optimizing your diet to intermittent fasting, exercise, stress, sleep, thought change. It's an 8-week program, but they have lifetime access, including to continued weekly office hours. So we're high touch point coaches. They can email for support. They can come live for support. And we open it a couple times a year. So the next one is September 6th through the 12th. And we actually have a free training called The 5 Mistakes That Sabotage Weight Loss After 50. And we're going to leave a link in the show notes, I think, if people want to register for that training. It's going to be really good. And it's a culmination of all of the coaching experience and the member experience. And there are some really common mistakes that people make. They think that they're eating healthy, they're trying to eat healthy, but they're not seeing the progress that they want. And we're going to talk about those inside that training. But I love it. I mean, this is kind of I call it my third child. This is so much work has gone into the development of this program to learn the science, to learn the psychology and the behavior change. And it's just a beautiful melding of all of that.
Well, I am so glad that you're out here doing this. I am going to register for the webinar myself because continuous improvement, always liking to learn more. And I highly recommend to the audience, register for that webinar. At least that's the first step to learn more. And then please do, if this is something that you are needing some extra assistance on, please do check out Zivli. We'll have all the links in the show notes, as well as the links to Zivli's social media, website, all of that kind of stuff. And Dr. Morgan Nolte, you are a wealth of information. Thank you so much for sharing some of that with us today.
Yeah, thank you for being so gracious on the podcast as a host, Megan. I really appreciate it.